So let's imagine for a moment that we are indeed standing amidst the ashes of London town, listening to the cries of families and the crackle of destruction all around us. This would have been one heck of a nightmare to wake up to. So let's get ourselves some water, pull ourselves together, and start piecing together how the hell we got here. It all started in the bakery of Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane. And if you've ever lived in London, I know you're thinking, wait, I've never heard of Pudding Lane. Well, that's because when we think of historic London, we tend to think of places like Fleet Street or Pudding Alley. See, this is part of the tragedy of Pudding Lane. In the Middle Ages, Pudding Lane was actually called, drum roll please, Pudding Lane. But over the years, it became known simply as the Lane, and today, the street bears no name at all. Number 4. Pudding Lane, however, does. That's where Thomas Farriner's bakery used to stand before his entire block was reduced to kindling. There's a little confusion about whether Thomas Farriner was asleep at the time the fire began or was up late baking bread. Given the fact that he awoke in time to try and save his house, I'm going to take the over on this one and assume he was working late. After all, we're talking about a man who spent his life surrounded by ovens. Probably doesn't take much to set him off. At first, the fire didn't seem like such a big deal. He tried to extinguish it with sacks of flour, but then realized he needed help. Someone must have sounded the alarm, because neighbors came running with their hand pumps and pails. It took 18 of these brave volunteers to carry the flaming embers away from the building. But by this point, the damage was done. By 2 a.m., the bakery was gone, along with 7 other houses. And this is where our story could have ended. Maybe if the wind hadn't shifted, the flames might have died down, leaving Farriner and his neighbors to lick their wounds. But now the wind was blowing embers towards Susan Hillhouse and her daughter Elizabeth, who were sleeping soundly upstairs in their house next door. And that innocent spark, that once looked like a pretty cool party trick, well, it's about to become the devil fruit in a horrifying game of hot potato. By 3:30 in the morning, the fire was spreading fast, licking its way up the roofs of the city. To make matters worse, London had seen an unusually long, hot summer. The air was filled with dried hay and resin, giving the fire a tinderbox to spread its wings and fly. This was a disaster of biblical proportions, and religious authorities weren't shy about making comparisons. One sermon likened the fire to God's judgment against the sins of Londoners. Another suggested it was punishment for the city's failure to punish witches properly. Others claimed it was an act of revenge by French Catholics, seeing as how England was busy persecuting Catholics at the time. But really, we may never know for sure. Though there were theories about Catholic arsonists, the most likely culprit was plain old fate, or rather a series of unfortunate circumstances. The year before, Londoners had suffered through a horrible outbreak of the plague, which killed an estimated 100,000 people. There was also a serious shortage of housing. New construction couldn't keep pace with immigration and population growth. And as a result, housing was cramped and expensive. Timber was cheap and plentiful, and building regulations required houses to be constructed of wood with thatched or tiled roofs. The streets were narrow, winding, and filthy, with piles of rotting garbage and human waste everywhere. And finally, there were tons of fires in London, and citizens were used to hearing the alarm. So when the fire bell rang on September 2nd, 1666, many Londoners assumed it was another false alarm and went back to sleep. When they finally realized the next morning that the fire wasn't going away, it was too late. There was nothing to do but run. This must have been terrifying. People fled with whatever they could grab. Some ran to the countryside, while others took refuge in the open fields surrounding London. Many sought shelter in the buildings of Westminster and Kensington, but they soon found themselves having to abandon their homes as the fire swept closer. There were refugees within a refugee crisis. Pregnant women, children, and the sick had nowhere to go. Some say the king's men offered to transport them out of the city, but nobody knows for sure. Some women did manage to escape to Westminster Abbey. We know this because the vestry book recorded that they provided food and bedding for the wives of Thomas Fairchild and Richard Gibson, along with 3 children. Their fathers, along with several other men, stayed behind to help fight the fire. And we know that things weren't looking good because the Rev. John Dillingham recorded that he was forced to stay awake for fear of being robbed in the crowded abbey. Others weren't so lucky. The citizens of London, already reeling from plague, poverty, and famine, were desperate and sometimes turned violent. When the fire spread to the Dutch neighborhood of Wapping, panicked Londoners blamed the Dutch for starting the fire. Unable to speak Dutch, Londoners thought the Dutch were conspiring against them, and they fell victim to the age-old practice of foreigners being blamed for all the world's problems. As the mob attacked, a woman named Rebecca Custis grabbed a pistol and defended herself and her husband until the sheriff arrived. But there was nothing they could do to stop the cycle of violence, looting, and terror that gripped the city. While officials did their best to restore order, they were also desperately trying to contain the blaze. At first, they tried to fight the fire with whatever resources they had, buckets of water and hand pumps. Then they organized. Citizens formed buckets brigades, passing water from the river to the fire to extinguish the flames. But it was hopeless. The fire was too big. They even resorted to bringing in gunpowder to blow up buildings and create fire breaks. But that only made things worse. In the end, the only thing that stopped the fire was the arrival of rain. As the smoke cleared, Londoners emerged from their hiding spots to survey the damage. It was catastrophic. 5 square miles of London were gone, including 13,000 homes and 87 churches. 100,000 people were homeless, most of whom had lost everything. London was unrecognizable. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the smell of burning lingered for months. And though the city would quickly begin the process of rebuilding, the scars of this disaster would last for centuries. In the weeks after the fire, Londoners buried the dead, tended to the sick, and debated who should pay for the reconstruction. The true cost of the Great Fire of London is impossible to calculate. Entire communities were wiped out, forcing families to start over with nothing. Businesses were destroyed, homes were demolished, and public works were damaged. All told, it's estimated that the fire caused between 6 and 10 million pounds in damages, or nearly 1 billion pounds in 2022. But here's the curious thing: despite all the damage and death, the fire probably saved London. The 17th century was a dangerous time to be alive. Diseases ran rampant, war was constant, and London was filthy. For example, during the plague of 1665, London's cemeteries were so full that they had to stop recording the dead. In the end, more people died in London from disease and starvation than from the fire. The Great Fire leveled the city, allowing London to rebuild from scratch. Londoners learned from their mistakes. They constructed sturdier homes out of brick instead of wood, and they planned the city more efficiently with wider streets and parks. As for Thomas Fariner, the man whose bakery started it all, he received compensation for his losses and went on to live a very long life. He died in 1715 at the age of 96, having survived 2 plagues and 1 fire. So how bad was it to be alive in 1666? Very. On the one hand, the fire destroyed the homes and livelihoods of tens of thousands of people. Homes were leveled, businesses were burned to the ground, and Londoners were forced to live in refugee camps. On the other hand, the fire may have saved London from itself. Disease and plague had already devastated the city. London was dirty, overcrowded, and on the brink of disaster. The fire allowed London to rise from the ashes and rebuild, giving Londoners a chance at a better quality of life. Maybe it was worth it to be alive in 1666 if it meant witnessing the rebirth of a city. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.